What does this airplane have in common with this airplane? Let's find out in Celebrating Aviation with Mike Mashat. What you see here represents the first and last of the piston and turboprop powered airliners by FOKKER Aircraft Company. In the 1950s, a number of very significant commercial aircraft came from Europe. The first you see here is the Bristol Britannia, known as the Whispering Giant. You had the Vickers Viscount, the world's first turboprop airliner to go into scheduled service. And from France, you had the Sud Aviation Caravelle. And then from the Netherlands was this airplane, the FOKKER F-27 Friendship. Now, I know what you're saying. If this is the FOKKER F-27, why does it say Fairchild on the forward fuselage? We'll get to that in a moment. But our story really begins on December 17th, 1935. That was the first flight date of the Douglas DC-3. And this is the airplane that revolutionized commercial air transport, a twin-engine, all-metal, low-wing, modern aircraft that could fly 25 passengers in comfort with relative safety and reliability. In World War II, the DC-3 served as the C-47 Skytrain transport. And after the war, in the late 1940s and into the 1950s, the DC-3 was really the backbone of the short and regional route airlines in the United States and really around the world. Many were converted C-47s, like the one you see here. It was a great airplane, but it was getting kind of long in the tooth, as they say, and a replacement was needed. So the race was on, and from Martin, we had the 202 and the 404. Convair produced the Convair liners, the 240 that you see here, and the larger 340 and 440 series. And from Lockheed came the Saturn proposal. It never went into production. And who better to do a DC-3 improvement than Douglas itself with the Super DC-3, which was a step up, but still not solving the problems of the unpressurized 25-passenger airliner well into the beginning of the jet age. This is the winner of the contest, the FOKKER F-27. But let's go back to the beginning. This is the FOKKER F-2, a 4-passenger transport, or 5-passenger if one of them was sitting next to the pilot. It had a 75-mile-an-hour cruise speed and a 750-mile range, which, believe it or not, was quite impressive when this airplane first flew in 1919. But the name FOKKER kind of arrived on the scene with this airplane. Up at top, you see the Douglas C-1, and below is the Atlantic C-2, which is the U.S. Army designation for the FOKKER F-7 triplane. And this airplane was named the question mark because it flew on an endurance flight and nobody knew when it was going to land. On January 1st, 1929, these two aircraft began a 6-day flight that covered 11,000 miles, flying a racetrack course between Los Angeles and San Diego using 43 aerial refuelings from the Douglas C-1. But here's the Atlantic C-2, or FOKKER F-7. It was a good, reliable airplane with 3 engines, as you see here. It had a wooden wing, which later was replaced by all-metal aircraft. And then the mammoth FOKKER airliner, this was the Airbus A380 of its day, the F-32. Now, if you want to win a good bar bet with aviation trivia, this is the airplane. One of my favorite all-time questions. What is the first commercial airliner that had 4 engines and operated on scheduled service in the United States? You're looking at it, the FOKKER F-32. It had a rather novel engine configuration. It was a pusher and puller tractor configuration that you see here. And notice that the forward engine has a 2-blade prop, while the pusher engine in the rear has a 3-blade prop. Very interesting. But fade to black, and now enter the jet age. And what you see here is the Rolls-Royce Dart turboprop engine. This first flew on, I'd say, scheduled service, but it was really mail and cargo on a British European Airways Dakota Douglas DC-3. And it went into service. It did fly successfully, but it was the very beginning. Later came the Vickers Viscount, the Handley Page Herald. From Japan, the NAMC YS-11, the Breguet Atlantic maritime patrol aircraft from France, and in America, the Gulfstream 1 from Grumman, a early executive transport. But on November 24th, 1955, in Amsterdam, the prototype Friendship made its first flight. It was an interesting airplane. It had high wing, twin engine, a tall main landing gear, and this allowed the passengers unobstructed views from each window. And it was a very elegant looking airplane. You notice on the prototype, those are data booms on the wingtips. They did not fly in the production versions with those devices. The cockpit was very clean. Today, these are referred to as steam gauges, but it was a fairly modern layout in the mid-1950s. And in the United States, under license, Fairchild built the F-27. Notice the white wall tires. Biggest difference was the fact that it contained an integral air stair that you see deployed here, and had thicker skins and uprated engines, and it was and a radar nose also. So it had a different look than the original F-27. In flight, very graceful looking airplane. It had an 84-foot length and a wingspan of 95 feet. Carried 32 passengers and had a max gross takeoff weight of 43,500 pounds. It had a 300 mile per hour top speed and a 800 to 1,600 mile range, depending on the payload and stage length for the airline. Now, I've seen this airplane somewhere with those markings, and I'm trying to remember where it was. Oh, yes, the Revell kit. There it is, the Fairchild F-27 prototype, white wall tires included. Artwork by the great Jack Lenwood. This was a beautiful kit, came in gleaming white plastic, and in a novel marketing move, Revell offered 7 airline decals plus the prototype, and for 10 cents you could send away for any of these airline decals to make it the airliner that flew in your region. Here's a good detail of the air stair on the Fairchild F-27. And the engines were Rolls-Royce Dart Mark 532s. They had 2,300 shaft horsepower each. And notice the interesting way that the cowling opened up for maintenance. On the East Coast in the US, the F-27s flew for Mohawk and Allegheny and Piedmont. In the Midwest was Ozark, and I'm guessing by that F-4 taking off with no auxiliary tanks, this photo was taken in St. Louis, where the McDonnell plant was located. On the West Coast, a number of airlines used the F-27. I just chose this stunning photo of a Pacific Airlines Friendship. And in the 1980s, West Coast service was resurrected with a company called Swift Air using actual Fokker F-27s. On December 28th, 1966, an enlarged, stretched version of the F-27 made its first flight at Hagerstown, Maryland, from the Fairchild plant, the FH-227. This upped the performance of the airplane. And here you see it in Piedmont colors. Passenger payload increased from 44 to 52 passengers, depending on the seat layout and density. And here you get a good view of how low the fuselage was to the ground. And this was done consciously in its design for access for the freight door in the forward fuselage and the passenger door as well. The F-27 served 43 airlines in 12 different countries around the world. Here we see the early 60s configuration of the Fairchild cockpit. And not to be outdone, Convair kind of upped the ante, putting turboprops on their 340 and 440 Convair liners. Here we see a Convair 580, which had the Allison 501 turboprops. Same engine is used on the Lockheed Electra. But on the West Coast, especially, the F-27 reigned supreme. And here we see a West Coast Airlines Friendship. a Bonanza F-27, and Bonanza, West Coast, and Pacific all merged to form Air West, and the F-27 was the queen of the fleet. As I mentioned, in the 1980s, Swift Air inaugurated service up and down the West Coast. And let's climb aboard and take a flight. Now, being an airliner geek, I had to sit at the window where I could see the landing gear going up and down. But here's the airplane at LAX, and you notice the fact that it's a FOKKER F-27 because you've got the portable stairs and no integral air stair. Fairchild proposed the F-27 as a military transport for the Air Force and the Army, but there were no takers. However, a number of foreign military air arms, like this one from Argentina, used the F-27 as a military transport. And of course, the U.S. Army used the F-27 for the Golden Knights parachute team, if you've ever seen that stunning air show display. This airplane was later replaced by a de Havilland Dash 8. Well, let's take a look at that Friendship cockpit from the early 60s and compare it to this. This is a 1980s cockpit, and this belongs to an upgrade of the F-27 called the FOKKER 50. FOKKER 50 is powered by Pratt & Whitney Canada PW125 turboprops that produce 2,500 shaft horsepower. Made its first flight on December 28th, 1985. Carries 62 passengers. And here we see the FOKKER 50 in scale with the Shorts SD330 and Airbus A320, and believe it or not, a Lufthansa Airport Express high-speed train. But this shows the role that the FOKKER 50 played in intercity travel, and it was a very successful airplane in Europe. KLM nicknamed the airplane the City Hopper. Let's take a look at the production numbers. The F-27 was built at 581 total. Fairchild produced 128 of these airplanes, and the FH-227 numbered 78. When you add in the FOKKER 50, the grand total of F-27 and variants was 1,000, a very successful airplane. Well, believe it or not, the time span between the Atlantic C2 and the F-27 was roughly 30 years. And just to celebrate the fact that the Top Gun Maverick movie came out the week that this video was being produced, I'm going to acknowledge that same time span with the F-14. And roughly 30 years later came the Boeing F-18 Super Hornet. Pretty dramatic example of progress in aviation. Well, there you have it, a look at the FOKKER F-27 and its variants. Special thanks to the late John Proctor and Craig Cadera for the use of their archives. And thank you for celebrating aviation with Mike Machette. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And until next time, take care.